the Casket Girls. By the time Storyville was a thing at the turn of the 20th century, the reputation of New Orleans as a place of loose morals was already cemented around the world for at least 100 years. As New Orleans became the biggest and richest city in the South, a tradition started around the 1790s of men coming down the Mississippi transporting goods. With the money they made, they took their time in New Orleans, the big cosmopolitan city, to see the elephant, according to Richard Campanella. In the Encyclopedia of Word and Phrase Origins by Robert Hendrickson, to see the elephant and hear the owl hoot means to, quote, have a good time deep into the night, a variation of the older see the elephant, which referred to seeing the elephant at the circus, the elephant not being a common sight to Americans in the 19th century, unquote. But even before that, one of the most embellished and repeated stories of early New Orleans is the Casket Girls, who are often sex workers in the legend. They came to New Orleans to be freed from prison for their disorderly conduct, and many trace the debaucherous reputation of New Orleans to this fact. In Spectacular Wickedness, Sex, Race, and Memory in Storyville, New Orleans, Emily Landau quotes historian Jennifer Spears' point that the women maybe became sex workers out of necessity when arriving in the colony. Landau also uses the commonly cited 1728 date of arrival of the Casket Girls. Quote, Spear writes that there was only one shipment of Casket Girls in 1728, but others have written that renewed supplies of the filles à la cassette arrived at intervals until the mid-century. Surely this latter view, if not strictly true, has maintained its salience in part as a result of the lore that all native white New Orleanians trace their lineage back to the filles à la cassette, and none to the prostitutes and convicts, and certainly not to the Indians or to the African slaves who were imported to the colony beginning in the early 1700s as well, unquote. Some will even claim that these women were vampires or smuggled vampires to Louisiana in their wooden chests. So they forgot to send women to the colony, but they managed to get enslaved Africans in the colony by 1719. There was an uncomfortable amount of children of mixed race growing up in Louisiana, as well as Frenchmen abandoning the French ways to go native. So many children of color, in fact, that they decided that slavery would pass to the children from the mother, ensuring that the children they created would remain enslaved upon birth. In a patriarchal European culture, they often defied their own traditions and logic when it came to the institution of slavery. The Casket Girls are filles à la cassette who arrived in January of 1721 on the ship La Baleine, are said to have come to the colony voluntarily, also called Bienville's Brides, or the Pelican Girls, and sometimes the Filles du Roi, or the King's Girls. They were typically orphans or women of good families, and were intended to help populate the colony by providing brides for the colonists. The caskets they carried were small wooden chests with their belongings that they called cassettes. They became caskets in English. The entry on 64 parishes explains, quote, as early as the first decade of the 18th century, French administrators and colonists understood that the presence of families would be needed for Louisiana to flourish. The filles à la cassette were therefore carefully selected for their reputations, age, and values so that they could contribute positively to the quality of the community, unquote. They became sex workers in the legend because they are often confused for the women who came to New Orleans on La Mutine 1 year earlier in February 1720, and on Les Deux Frères in 1719, who are often called correction girls. These women were prisoners banished to Louisiana forever. They included a woman accused of murdering 15 people. Amazingly, historian Joan DeJean found the entire police file for her case. Virginia Gould began the research that shows us that the women of La Mutine were much more than the tarnished reputations we remember. However, she reports the common myth about these women, that they were indeed women of ill repute, including the woman accused of murdering 15 people. Some estimates say that 7,000 women were sent to the colony, but only 1,300 made it. By 1728, only 178 were still living, according to Buying a Bride by Marcia Zug. Joan DeJean goes deeper. Dr. DeJean explains that the women of La Mutine were prisoners who were accused of sex work and other crimes. She shows us that their status as loose women was likely accusations, not based in reality. One example in both Gould and de Jean's research is Marie Anne Fontaine, who came to New Orleans at 38 years old. She was in prison for life in France for returning to Paris after she was banished. She was the woman accused of 15 murders. Gould explains that she was one of the women who made it to the colony and married. De Jean gives us more information about the woman who went by Manon Fontaine because everyone was named Marie. She was 19 when she was locked up and had served 19 years in prison. She was also probably not a very rare female serial killer. De Jean gives us these details. Quote, even though Manon had been elsewhere at the time of the crime and could prove it. Even though, under questioning, the alleged witnesses who had testified against her had all admitted that they had never seen her before, Manon Fontaine spent 19 years behind bars until she was transported to Louisiana. Unquote. Dr. Gould tells us that Marie Anne was a prostitute, but Dr. de Jean explains that she was a vendor in Paris who sold Dale's fruit from a basket she carried when she was arrested and accused of murder. She was known as La Bouquetière, the flower girl, because she started by selling small bouquets of flowers. Manon's deportation was the result of an alleged seditious revolt while she was in prison. She was one of 3 women accused of leading a violent revolt by the prison guard, a woman with 50 years of rule over the imprisoned women. She was deported in 1719 with 16 other women from prison. According to de Jean, she was one of the first women from prison to marry in New Orleans. The man she married in the colony was a blacksmith named Bourguignon. Manon eventually owned property in her own right in what is now the 800 block of Bourbon Street. She lived until 1734. Hopefully the 3rd chapter of the life of the flower girl was as happy and prosperous as these details indicate. Regardless of the truth of the filles à la cassette and Manon Fontaine and other women of the colony, their reputation remained. New Orleans was a place with loose morals and a culture built on pleasure. How the Casket Girls became vampires. Why do so many sources say the filles à la cassette arrived in 1728? The 3rd floor shutters on the old Ursuline convent, which are never opened and never appear opened in any image of the building, are proof that the Casket Girls were vampires, according to the legend. Or were the caretakers of vampires, or something. The girls arrived in 1728, in the legend, and they lived with the Ursuline nuns who were charged with educating the young women of the colony. They are sometimes referred to as vampires because of their wooden chests, cassette in French, which became casket in the legend. Sometimes the girls are the vampires who live in the chests. Sometimes they were transporting the vampires who lived in the chests. Sometimes they were extremely pale and sickly, another quality shared with vampires, from the hard voyage to New Orleans. Many, many, many sources cite the 1728 date, including Emily Landau in Spectacular Wickedness. The sources for the 1728 date in Spectacular Wickedness are Charles Gaillard's History of Louisiana from 1854, John Smith Kendall's History of New Orleans Volume 1 from 1922, Herbert Asbury's The French Quarter from 1936, and Harnett Kane's Queen New Orleans from 1949. These sources were published 126 to 221 years after their claim, and only one includes a bibliography. Gaillard's is the oldest book referenced from 1854. He explains briefly that the girls arrived in 1728 in a vessel, but doesn't name it. They are from houses of correction in this version. Quote, the company had given to each of them a casket containing some articles of dress. From that circumstance, they became known in the colony under the nickname of the filles à la cassette, or the Casket Girls. The Ursulines were requested to take care of them until they should be provided with suitable husbands. Subsequently, it became a matter of importance in the colony to derive one's origin from the Casket Girls rather than the Correction Girls. What distinctions, however slim they may be, will not be eagerly sought after by human pride. Unquote. Kendall's explanation from 1922, quote, "In the winter of 1727 and 1728, the arrival of the first of those groups of reputable young girls sent by the French authorities to the care of the Ursulines, to be disposed of, under their superintendency, in marriage with the settlers, infused a new element into the population. They brought with them each a small chest of clothing, whence the name Filles à la Cassette, the Casket Girls, by which they and other similar consignments in subsequent years are known in the history of the colony." Unquote. He explains in the footnote that the last group arrived in 1751, but no ship is listed and no sources for any of it. Herbert Asbury, who also wrote Gangs of New York in 1928, wrote The French Quarter, an informal history of the New Orleans underworld in 1936. He is the one who includes a bibliography, but he doesn't reference any source directly. He distinguishes the Casket Girls from the Correction Girls and makes the same claim that they first arrived in 1728 and continued until 1751. He concludes with the same joke about how all New Orleanians have Casket Girls as ancestors, not Correction Girls, Africans, or natives. In 1949, Harnett T. Kane actually does not claim that the Casket Girls arrived in 1728, but the early 1720s, and goes on to repeat the same joke about how fertile the Casket Girls were and how barren the Correction Girls were. He doesn't cite his own source either, but he does tell us the story of Manon Lescaut, one of the Correction Girls. Manon is the subject of a novel published in 1731 by Antoine Francois Prévost, and then an opera by Puccini in 1893. It was not considered history at the time, but it was so controversial that it was banned. Kane's retelling is repeated as though it was history. In Buying a Bride from 2016, Marcia Zug theorizes that the Casket Girls are fiction created so that Louisianians could trace their ancestry to respectable women, similar to all the jokes about fertility made by the historical sources written by men. She points out that 1728 is after any Correction Girls arrived, so they couldn't be confused with the criminals. A nagging detail Zug points out, though, is that the only women to arrive in the 1727 through 1728 time frame were the Ursuline nuns, who, by the way, deny that they housed the Casket Girls. While the Casket Girls aren't entirely fiction, their association with the Ursuline nuns is seemingly fiction. The Ursuline convent is the oldest building around, but it wasn't built until the 1750s. Before this building, the one previous to that was built in the 1730s. In addition, in photographs of this building from the mid-20th century, the third-floor windows didn't even have shutters. There are at least 4 ghosts said to linger in the area surrounding St. Louis Cathedral: Père Dagobert, Père Antoine, pirates, and William Faulkner. These are the legends.
I have questions for you about our future at the dynamo in the sky.
Père Dagobert was the beloved priest before Père Antoine arrived in New Orleans. He came in 1722 from Quebec and died in 1776. For nearly 50 years, throughout the entire French colonial period, Père Dagobert was the remembered priest. His ghost is said to carry out the ritual of his miraculous good deed during his lifetime. When Governor Alexander O'Reilly, an Irish-born professional military leader at the service of the Spanish crown, arrived in New Orleans, his call for Spanish power involved first murdering the rebellious Frenchmen who would not comply with the Spanish authority. He shot them near the location where Frenchmen Street is today. The legend holds that as a sign of just how little O'Reilly would tolerate rebellion, he refused to allow the Frenchmen a proper burial and instead left their bodies to rot where they fell. It was Père Dagobert who insisted on defying O'Reilly's authority and giving the rebels a burial as required by their religion. Despite swarming guards, he is said to have dragged their bodies from the St. Charles Fort near the end of Frenchmen Street today to St. Peter Street Cemetery, which occupied the block surrounded by St. Peter, Burgundy, Toulouse, and Rampart Streets. His singing spirit carries out this miraculous task in the morning mist in Père Antoine Alley. Sometimes the tale says the Frenchmen were buried at St. Louis No. 1, but that cemetery was not built until 1789. Sometimes the bodies were on display on the banks of the river and brought to the church for a funeral, making their miraculous journey much shorter. Père Dagobert also gets helpers to perform his miracle in some versions. We have news reports of the events and even a list of the 5 men who were executed. One of the men, Lafitte, the Attorney General, is honored with a park named for him in nearby Metairie. There are 88 burials listed in the St. Peter Street Cemetery in the Find a Grave database, but none match the names of the Frenchmen. None of those buried in St. Peter Street were buried in 1769 because the records were lost in the 1788 fire when the church burned, making this ghost story all the more plausible. Frenchmen Street is named by creative street namer Bernard de Marigny when he subdivided his neighborhood in 1805 in honor of these French rebels turned martyrs who defied the Spanish crown. The earliest reference I can find to Père Dagobert in relation to the burial of the Frenchmen was in 1929. The earlier references to beloved Père Dagobert are in relation to his singing. A poem written by Molly E. Moore Davis was printed in Harper's Weekly in 1887, more than 100 years after the priest's death. She refers to him as the singing Father Dagobert, with a clear voice everyone wanted to hear. She did not refer to his miracle with the Frenchmen in her prose. In the 1929 article from the New Orleans Item explains that the rumor began to circulate after O'Reilly killed the Frenchmen that Père Dagobert was able to bury them in the yard of the church in unmarked graves. Gumbo Yaya, the 1945 book by Lyle Saxon about Louisiana folktales, does include Père Dagobert, but the priest is not saintly in this version, and instead is gluttonous and worldly and haunts the cathedral in fine clothing. A more interesting truth than his time in New Orleans coinciding with the Spanish takeover is that he was in New Orleans when the filles à la cassette, the women who would become known to some as New Orleans' first vampires, arrived in New Orleans to live with the Ursuline nuns and become the wives for the settlers. In a 2022 article for The Advocate, Gordon Russell explained that some historians point to the revolt of 1768 as a precursor to the American Revolution. Gordon explains that it is often considered the, quote, first uprising of the Atlantic world Creoles against imperial intrusions, unquote. He is quoting Lawrence Powell in The Accidental City. Unsurprisingly, New Orleans was once again at the front of the march toward becoming truly American. The beloved priest, Père Antoine. In 1763, Louisiana became a Spanish colony, and the Spanish Capuchin friars were sent in 1772 to replace the French. However, Fray Antonio de Sedea, the friar who would become known as Père Antoine, did not arrive until around 1780. It is said that Père Antoine kept a sparse residence in New Orleans in St. Anthony's Garden until his death in 1829. And there is archaeological evidence that he did. Père Antoine was the priest in New Orleans who plays into many of the stories that shape our history. He both baptized and married Marie Laveau. He married Delphine to Dr. Lalaurie, and he married the first American governor of Louisiana, William C.C. Claiborne, to his third wife. He was supposedly sent to New Orleans as part of the Spanish Inquisition. In a 1919 appreciation piece for the Louisiana Historical Society, Clarence Wyatt Bispham writes, quote, "We first notice him in the stern and harsh garb of the attempted administrator of the Inquisition. No country in all the world was so bound hand and foot by the Inquisition as Spain. No city was more free from this heavy burden than New Orleans under French domination." Unquote. Père Antoine is ultimately a controversial figure whose biography seemed to be clouded by the glow of a post-life halo perpetuated by the church's propaganda and the complicit journalists and tour guides who repeat it. But as always, the truth is much more interesting than the sanitized fiction. Bispham claims that there are three competing views of Père Antoine. Number 1, a saintly and generous priest. Number 2, a controversial figure, to put it mildly, who may have been a criminal. And finally, number 3, quote, a scheming, adventurous, and dangerous man who must be carefully watched, unquote. He was born in Cedella, Spain in 1748 on November 18th and became a priest in 1771 in Granada. He came to New Orleans in 1780. In an 1878 article in the Times Democrat, he is described, quote, "He seems to have had a grand old face, long and yet massive in its length. If one might speak of the architecture of a face, I should say that his was Gothic, of the middle period. His snowy beard flowed down even to the hempen girdle at his waist, and together with his tonsure lent him the holy aspect of a medieval St. Anthony. His habit was of the coarsest brown material, and his naked feet were protected by wooden sandals," unquote. He was the priest who refused to ring the bells on Good Friday in 1788 when a fire broke out at the residence of Don Vicente Jose Nunez, the treasurer who was praying with candles near a curtain in unusual wind. The story goes that Père Antoine insisted that Good Friday was a solemn day and bells should not be rung. Or perhaps it was impossible to ring the bells because they had been wrapped with cotton to prevent the inadvertent ringing due to high winds. Regardless, 80% of the city, including the cathedral, was destroyed. In 1790, he was exiled back to Spain for 5 years. Some older biographies point to sinful behavior of adultery and even murder as the reason for the beloved priest's exile. Richard Greenleaf claims it was for inquisitorial behavior that was polarizing the colony in his article, The Inquisition in Spanish Louisiana, 1762 through 1800. Greenleaf quotes Governor Miro, who wrote, quote, "These foreigners are imbued with and very frightened of the power of the Holy Office, which they consider absolutely despotic and discriminatory, notwithstanding the uprightness, stature, and circumspection of its most just proceedings," unquote. The construction of a new church, known today as Almanasser's Church, as he was the major patron, began in 1789. The city burned again in December 1794, but the new church was spared and dedicated as a cathedral on December 24th, 1794. After the fires, many people sought refuge in St. Anthony's Garden, where Père Antoine had his shack, in temporary housing as so many people were homeless. But this housing was not free. Shannon Lee Doughty points out in Archaeological Investigations at St. Anthony's Garden, Volume 2, that there were rental fees attached to the temporary housing, which provided income for the church. Père Antoine appealed his exile and ultimately returned to New Orleans in 1795. He was elected rector of the church at the beginning of the 19th century after the church attempted to remove his priestly authority. Very few of the modern biographies seem to include much of the controversy surrounding Père Antoine's time in New Orleans or his exile from the city. He is honored by his nickname on Père Antoine Alley. According to Catholic.com, quote, "Few priests have been more assailed by historians, but a careful comparison of the ancient records of the cathedral with the traditions that cluster about his memory show that he did not deserve, on the one hand, the indignities which historians heap upon him, nor the excessive honors with which tradition has crowned him. From the cathedral archives, it has been proven that he was simply an earnest priest, striving to do what he thought his duty amid many difficulties," unquote. Père Antoine died in 1829, and his funeral was apparently a huge display attracting people of all religions, races, and classes, who seemingly completely forgot about his initial Inquisition intentions. According to some, the newspapers requested the presence of Freemasons at his funeral, particularly the members of l'Étoile Polaire. Curious for a Catholic priest to earn such respect from the Masons, as Catholics are forbidden from joining to this day. Père Antoine arrived in New Orleans in 1780, and he is perhaps the most remembered priest from early New Orleans history. He is sometimes mistaken for the ghost of Père Dagobert in Père Antoine Alley, possibly because the alley honors him. Sometimes Père Antoine is seen in Pirates Alley. Sometimes Père Dagobert is in Pirates Alley also. Perhaps the two beloved priests have a spirited afterlife, debating theology and reminiscing about their time in New Orleans, as we are all wont to do. In the 1938 New Orleans City Guide, the Pirates Alley moniker is given no explanation. It proclaims, quote, "On either side of the cathedral, running back the length of the block to Royal Street, are Orleans and St. Anthony alleys. The former has of recent years come to be known as Pirates Alley, though there is no basis for this name." Unquote. Shannon Lee Doughty explains that the Pirates Alley nickname was adopted by 1922 to distinguish what was two alleys named Orleans on either side of the cathedral. The 1938 City Guide also explains that fencing was once a common sport in the city, and that the area behind the cathedral was once the common location of duels. The book also cites an annual event held in St. Anthony's Garden on Mardi Gras Day of a fencing exhibition. I found references to the Mardi Gras Duello in the newspaper, but only in 1937 so far, the year the City Guide was written. Legend holds that this space was used for duels in the city until the bishop decided it was too noisy to be near the church, and it was outlawed in 1855. The dueling moved to the area now known as City Park until it was fully outlawed in 1890. One dueling oak in City Park still stands just outside the entrance to the sculpture garden. Duels were once a common occurrence in antebellum and colonial New Orleans, and they had some rules. For instance, the challenger chose the weapon. Duels were often recounted in the newspapers also. There was no mention of duels in Shannon Lee Doughty's report of the archaeological evidence, so I emailed her to ask about any evidence for duels in her excavation. Here is her reply. Quote, "Well, I did find a few lead musket balls and shot in the garden, but since I'm convinced this space was used as a market space and campground in the 18th century, this is not at all surprising. They are ubiquitous on the sites of the era. Doesn't mean that they were fired. Made of lead, they could have also served as weights for various things or used as gaming pieces, etc., or just a random lost item from a hunter or soldier. In terms of the archives, no evidence duels happened here that I've seen, though there are a couple of cases documented elsewhere. See The Devil's Empire. It's one of those stories that is probably half true, but we'll never know which half." Unquote. Did the Pirates Alley nickname come from the custom of dueling among the Creoles? Another theory is that the alley was used by actual pirates to sell their wares. Using the space as a marketplace, much like the artists lining the fence do today, is a tradition as old as the colony of New Orleans, according to Doughty's excavation. From Native American markets in the early colonial days to a pleasure garden in the antebellum time, which ended with the erection of the fence, now artists lining the fence carry on a century-old tradition of New Orleanians sharing their talent with visitors and spreading the products of the city around the world. The artists probably mingle and mix easily with any pirates lingering between realms. Around the time that the fence became an art gallery, the 1920s, an unknown writer lived with another man in 624 Pirates Alley. He wrote a novel in 1925. His voyage to the city was not unique. Many artists spent time in New Orleans then, like now, leading to the public art shows he probably witnessed. His time in the city was short, about 6 months, but the novel he wrote while he was here was published, and eventually he published more. He became a Nobel laureate and one of the most renowned American writers, William Faulkner. His home is currently a bookstore where some claim to smell his tobacco smoke when they visit. About halfway down Pirates Alley, just after the Faulkner House bookstore, you'll find another alley running behind the Cabildo to St. Peter Street. Today we call this Cabildo Alley, but it was the end of Exchange Alley in the past. Exchange Alley was built to facilitate commerce between the Americans in Faubourg Saint-Marie, now the Central Business District, and the Creoles in the Vieux Carré. You can find other remnants of it in the French Quarter closer to Canal Street. It is no coincidence that this alley ran directly to both the St. Louis Hotel, now the Omni Royal Orleans, and the Cabildo, the site of the government. The St. Louis Hotel Rotundo was a site of significant trade in enslaved people who were a primary commodity in New Orleans, and the Cabildo once had a prison on the grounds. If tortured energy is what leads to ghosts, certainly the area remains populated. I've seen one reference to a ghost of Madame Lalaurie haunting the cathedral grounds. This seemed to be more about search engine optimization to me than any basis in actual lore or truth, so I guess I'm doing the same. Make sure to watch my video of what really happened at the Lalaurie mansion. Have you seen any ghosts in the alleys? I would love to hear your stories. More New Orleans history and tours from the deep, coming soon. In the years since I first attempted to retell the true story of Delphine Lalaurie, I have discovered some silly mistakes in my retelling. For instance, Paul and Blanc attended Yale University, not Princeton. The house sold again in 2024 for more than $10 million, reportedly to a Chinese investor whose offer was accepted before the property was even listed. But what did we learn from the real estate photos? I am Leah Pearl, and this is the story of Mad Madame Lalaurie, the mistress of the haunted house. She has inspired legends for almost 200 years in New Orleans. But what if the story is true? What can we know from our records and contemporary sources? Well, you may be surprised to learn that most of this story is verifiable, down to her burial in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. But what is more surprising to me is that this is the only story of this kind that has lasted. The documented cruelty by Delphine Lalaurie was not unique. The unique aspect is that we still tell her story. White women in antebellum New Orleans were known for being cruel and torturous, especially to those they enslaved. The truths about Madame Lalaurie do not require any embellishments to turn your stomach. It is a questionable fact of the human species that we are drawn to the goriest and most grotesque stories. This bloodlust is also revealed in the fact that white women were known for being particularly cruel to their enslaved people. The theories on why this is true has been and will be debated. We will discuss the legends, and I will share the truth. Knowing what is documented tends to turn my stomach more than the hyperbole we can roll our eyes at. You have been warned. A quirk of Louisiana that makes this retelling of the documentation possible is our use of Roman civil law instead of English common law. Since I first wrote this, I have become a commissioned notary public in the civil law tradition for the state of Louisiana, so my understanding has developed. Louisiana was French from 1718 until 1762, and then Spanish until October 1st, 1800, when it transferred back to French rule. The Louisiana Purchase Treaty was signed in Paris on April 30th, 1803, although the return to French rule wasn't acknowledged until November 30th, 1803, 20 days before the Louisiana Purchase was formally acknowledged in New Orleans on December 30th, 1803. During all of the transitions, the laws in Louisiana remained basically the same. When the Louisiana Territory became American, they first said that there were already so many contracts and legal filings and lawyers to untangle that they basically decided to not untangle it. until they could convene a territorial legislature with the ultimate goal of introducing common law, like the rest of the United States. However, by 1808, a digest of the civil laws now in force in the territory of Orleans, with alterations and amendments adopted to its present form of government, commonly referred to as the Civil Code of 1808, was adopted by the legislature. About 85% was derived from drafts of Napoleon's code. While Louisiana did not adopt the Napoleonic Code, if there is a question about the translation, the original French is still used over the English to this day. Another oddity in Louisiana is the prevalence, requirement, of Catholicism in Louisiana before freedom of religion reigned with the American takeover. The Catholic Church records all sacraments, and all citizens of the colony had to be Catholic by law. Through the notarial records and the records of the Archdiocese of New Orleans, we can piece together life stories. When they were born through baptismal records, when they married, what property they bought and sold through recorded acts of sale, their involvement with trading enslaved people through notarial acts, as they were once considered movable property, wills and testaments, contracts, and anything else that may have been notarized. So while the legends of Delphine are many, we can piece together some truths about her life and why she has become so infamous in history. Let's start with the legends. Madame Lalaurie, who lived at 1140 Royal Street, was a premier socialite in New Orleans from an old Creole family. Her husband, Dr. Lalaurie, was a doctor. There were rumors of unusual cruelty toward her enslaved people, but investigations yielded only glowing reports of Delphine's charming nature. During a party one night, her home caught fire, and when the fire brigade arrived to assist, she requested, rudely, that instead of rescuing her enslaved people, they rescue her antique furniture. They refused her request and discovered the mutilated and tortured people that Delphine had enslaved. 7 people were rescued that night, and they were brought to the cabildo for treatment and food. Meanwhile, an angry crowd gathered around the fire-consumed home and dismantled what didn't burn. Madame Delphine escaped via coach to Lake Pontchartrain, where she met a schooner to the North Shore, and eventually on to Mobile, where she fled for Paris and spent her remaining days in exile. Her escape from justice hangs heavy over the property. After she fled, many bones were discovered in the courtyard and well at the Royal Street property. One was of a young enslaved girl named Leah, who is said to have hit a snag in Delphine's hair while she was brushing it. Delphine became so enraged, and Leah was so scared, that she chased her to the gallery, and the girl jumped to her death to avoid the punishment at the hands of Delphine. The girl's bones are said to be among those found. The bricked-up window is said to be where she jumped from. Since Delphine was run out of New Orleans, this home has served as a conservatory of music, and a school, and a furniture store, as well as the private residence of Nick Cage for a while. But no one is said to be able to remain there for long, as the ghosts of the tortured enslaved people who lived there have not been able to cross from this realm, or let anyone who stays there long rest, as they were prevented from doing. Delphine never returned to New Orleans in life, but she was interred at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, and a decaying plaque noting her burial was discovered in the 1940s on a tomb. Let me know in the comments if I missed a detail you know. How much of this can we account for? Surprisingly, a lot of it was documented in the contemporary times. I won't be diving into any of the accounts that attempt to defend Delphine. We have far too much evidence to consider it likely that this was some kind of smear campaign against her or her family. In addition, as I've mentioned, this type of cruelty was not necessarily unique to Delphine. She had at least one relative who was also credibly accused of killing her enslaved people. The torture and fire at 1140 Rue Royale happened. There is little doubt. So let's dive into the story of Madame Lalaurie and the haunted house on Rue Royale. We'll go point by point to show what we know to be true and what we think is likely based on the documented sources. To do this, I've used Carolyn Morrow Long's 2012 book, Madame Lalaurie, as my source. She has gone through all of the known documentation to find the details we know to be true, and this is the definitive book on the topic as of today. If you don't want the myths dispelled, this is your warning to exit. Starting with the villain, Madame Lalaurie. She was, in fact, a socialite who was from an old Creole family well known in New Orleans. She was born Delphine McCarty in 1787 in the midst of rebellions of enslaved people in Louisiana and Saint-Domingue. You may have guessed that her heritage is Irish, not French, and you are correct. Her great-grandfather was a captain in the Irish regiment of Albemarle, who escaped the tyranny of the English kings to France and became a Knight of St. Louis. Delphine's grandfather came to Louisiana from France in 1732. Delphine's father, Louis, was a first-generation Creole. Her family had a plantation just south of the city. It was where the press train tracks lie currently. This location is infamous as where Homer Plessy was arrested for sitting in a white car of the train, leading to the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which codified Jim Crow segregation until Brown versus the Board of Education overturned it in 1954. Her plantation was where these tracks are, and this area was known as Faubourg Delphine when she began selling it off, until the railroad company purchased some of it, and it became a train yard. Where the plantation house stood, there is a World War I Victory Arch in a green space known as McCarty Square. Delphine was married thrice. She was first married to Ramon Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria when she was 13 in 1800. He was 35 and a widower. 4 years later, the Republic of Haiti was established after the successful revolt of enslaved people on Saint-Domingue that had lasted much of Delphine's life. Her first husband Lopez died in Cuba in the same year after a ship ran aground while they were on the way to Madrid. Days later, she gave birth to her first child, Borgia, who was named after her dead husband's first wife. Lopez was known as being the Spanish official who reopened the African slave trade in Louisiana, even with the fear of rebellion that loomed over the colony. Delphine returned to New Orleans with her child. She wed her second husband, Jean Blanc, in 1807, shortly after her mother died. Her mother was not murdered by those she enslaved. However, her uncle, by marriage, Jean-Baptiste César Le Breton, was murdered in 1771, more than a decade before Delphine was born. His enslaved people were accused, tried, and punished, two by death, for the murder. This is the story recounted in Chapter 8, Temba Murders His Master, of Lyle Saxon's book, Old Louisiana, originally published in 1929. Jean Blanc was a well-respected figure in New Orleans. He was the go-between for Jean Lafitte and Governor Claiborne during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Jean was known as a shrewd businessman, and he was involved in the politics of the city. He was a director of the Louisiana Bank and bought property nearby, which is now 409 Royal Street. The couple split their time between this property and their plantation, known as Villa Blanc, which was near the property she grew up on below the city. They had 4 children, Pauline, Laure, Jean, and Pauline. In a letter from Claiborne, territorial governor, to James Madison, he wrote, quote, John Blanc resides near New Orleans and is a merchant in high credit. About 3 years ago, he married a very beautiful Creole lady possessing a large estate and connected with one of the most numerous and respectable families in the county of Orleans. Mr. Blanc is a man of genius and education and possesses considerable influence in the city. He is a member of the city council, a director of the Louisiana Bank, and has been for the last 3 years a member of the House of Representatives for the territory. Mr. Blanc is much disliked by most of the Native Americans residing in and near New Orleans. His attachments are supposed to be wholly foreign, and they consider him a dangerous man. Unquote. Slightly ironic that Jean Blanc and the Lafitte brothers sided with the Americans during the battle. Without their assistance, it's likely the New Orleans would have been taken by the British, even though that battle occurred after the war was over. Shortly after the Battle of New Orleans, Jean Blanc died in 1815. He was 50 years old, and Delphine was now 28 and a widow again. Enslaving people was common among the upper class society of New Orleans at this time, and it was expected by people like Delphine. They literally could not maintain their lifestyles without unpaid labor making it happen on a daily basis. Delphine owned at least 54 people throughout her life that we can account for, but it was her union with Jean Blanc that saw her traffic in people increase. It seems that one of his primary sources of income was in the slave trade, and he died with a considerable debt. Delphine worked to settle his estate. While she did emancipate at least one person during this time at Jean's request in his will, 8 others died under her watch during this time after Blanc died and before she met her third and final husband. The deaths were recorded without cause at St. Louis Cathedral. They were primarily women and children. In 1824, Delphine's money troubles from Jean Blanc were alleviated by the death of her father. He left her and her brother a valuable estate. He also included his child with a free woman of color in his will, who received $5,000 and 2 slaves. On February 17, 1825, Dr. Louis Lalaurie arrived in New Orleans from France. He had finished his training as a physician at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1823, but he was not from a prominent family. His expertise was in treating orthopedic conditions such as hunchbacks. He was told by his father to find a wealthy woman to marry in New Orleans to help raise the prominence of his family. Delphine and Dr. Lalaurie met in 1825. She was a wealthy woman by both inheritance and at this time by her own business acumen. She was a grandmother and 38 years old. Louis was 22. Their son, Jean-Louis, was born in 1827, and the couple finally wed after the doctor returned from a visit to France in 1828. In 1831, they acquired the partially built townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets in the city for their residence. The building looked more like this drawing than the modern building at this address. Remember, the house burned, and there were only 2 stories at the time. But before we finish exploring the documented story of Delphine, I want to examine our fixation on antebellum stories as the basis for our horror and ghost fetish in the modern times. While I was searching for portraits of Delphine and her 3 husbands, I found this book, Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era by Taya Miles. Dr. Miles analyzes the story of Delphine as well as Carolyn Morrow Long's interpretation of the evidence and the modern conception of the story through ghost tours. She points out that we wouldn't have ghost tours of the 9/11 memorial, as that would be considered distasteful by all. Indeed, Mary Millen is one of the figures in Long's book who conducts a seance and claims to speak with the ghosts of the enslaved people who died there in the epilogue. She calls herself Bloody Mary, as well as a priestess and queen of voodoo. She was also widely criticized in 2018 for creating the Haunted History Museum, a tour she holds in an apartment where a gruesome murder-suicide occurred in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. But this tour still exists in a city where friends of the victims still live. In my research, I have noticed over and over again that the figures who still captivate our attention hundreds of years later all lived during roughly the same time. The Baroness Pontalba, Don Almonaster, the Lafitte brothers, Marie Laveau, Père Antoine, and Delphine Lalaurie all lived in the same New Orleans. All of the stories come from the same half-century or so when people were allowed to own other people of African descent. And much of the horror in the stories focuses specifically on the violence against the enslaved. Violence that is not legally possible today. In a world where the common story was once one of genteel dominance that did not involve violence through lost cause efforts at rewriting history, we have swung to fetishizing the violence against black and brown bodies in the past, while distancing ourselves from the violence of today. Dr. Miles points out that this is a form of othering. We can remove ourselves from the cruelty and horror of the past because we do not allow that behavior now. In the same way that Delphine is always described as Creole and not just white or American, enslavers are other than us, the civilized people of today. I am guilty of this in my own retelling. In the first part of this story, I always described Delphine as Creole, which in Delphine's time would have meant someone who was born in Louisiana to parents who were born elsewhere. Implying that Creole women were particularly cruel is another rewriting of the facts, as Dr. Miles points to numerous sources in the evidence that show that white women, Creole or not, were violent and cruel. Violence by women against enslaved people was not abnormal at all. Delphine is doubly othered in the ghost story to make her mad and Creole, and definitely not like the other slavers. But the truth is, she was just like the other slavers. Dr. Miles also carefully points out that the crowds that destroyed the Lalaurie mansion are described simply as being of all classes and colors in the newspaper accounts. It is unlikely that other high society slave-owning white people destroyed her residence because they could not tolerate her crimes. We have plenty of evidence that they were guilty of the same or similar crimes, including in the contemporary accounts that describe the crowds of being stopped by the sheriff to prevent the same destruction of more slave owners. More likely, it was abolitionists who expressed their outrage. Abolition was gaining momentum in the North around the time of the fire. In the Boston Post, we get this account, quote, "The mob assembled again on Friday night with a view to complete their work of destruction and to wreak their vengeance on other persons accused of being guilty of similar conduct to that of Madame Lalaurie." But the authorities were on the watch. The alarm was given, and a part of the Legion and the U.S. troops were soon under arms and on the field of action. Mr. Holland, the deputy sheriff, read the riot act to the crowd, which soon dispersed, and perfect order has been restored, and we hope may never again be disturbed by a like impolitic and dangerous movement, not to be excused in this city, even by the scandalous outrages that gave rise to it. Unquote. With this in mind, let's continue the story of Delphine and why her story has lasted through time. The townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets was always in her name in the records. She and Louis lived there until 1832, when Delphine petitioned for a separation from Lalaurie, and it was granted. From letters one of her neighbors sent to his family in France, we learned that Delphine's marriage to Louis was notoriously unhappy. One of her claims in the separation petition was, quote, "On the 26th of October last, 1832, in the presence of many witnesses, the said Louis Lalaurie went so far as to not only ill-treat her, but even to beat and wound her in the most outrageous and cruel manner." Unquote. It seems that perhaps her vicious nature was not only common among white women, but white men as well. Dr. Miles posits that the protection of white men from the historical narrative of cruelty as represented in stories like Delphine's is a way of maintaining the paternalistic and patriarchal hierarchy of antebellum times. In some accounts of the torture at the Lalaurie mansion, history has rewritten the story so that the doctor was experimenting on those he enslaved, leading to the appearance of torture. After Delphine separated from him, Louis went to live in rural Plaquemines Parish, and not much is known about what he did there. However, the neighbors noted that the marriage of the Lalauries was exceptionally dramatic, and their separations and reconciliations were well known. The doctor did return to the Royal Street home and participated in business transactions with his wife after the separation. He was also present the day of the fire. On April 10th, 1834, during the morning, the kitchen, which was in an outbuilding attached to the two-story mansion, caught fire. The Lalauries' across the street neighbor was Judge Jacques-Francois Canage, who observed them removing valuables in case the main building also caught fire. He suggested that they, quote, "have the slaves removed to a place of safety," unquote. Dr. Lalaurie was quoted in the newspaper to have replied in an insulting tone, quote, "There were persons who would do much better by remaining at home than visiting others to dictate to them laws in the quality of officious friends," unquote. The newspaper reported that he did not abide by this request and instead ordered that they break down the doors. 7 tortured people were discovered, chained, mutilated, starved, and inhumanely brutalized. They brought them to the columns under the cabildo for treatment and to become a human zoo. Some accounts say 2,000 people viewed them. Some say it was 4,000 people who viewed the people who received the violence of the Lalauries. Regardless, thousands of people bore witness to the violent and secret spectacle revealed by the fire at the Lalaurie mansion. Modern tours such as that at the Gallier House nearby and the Herman Grima House on St. Louis Street focus on the experience of the enslaved. These urban enslavement tours go out of their way to distinguish the ways in which urban enslavement was different than the plantation slavery most people are familiar with. On both of these tours, the guides explain that the enslaved on plantations were given different treatment. For instance, on plantations, they may be expected to grow their own foods in small gardens they tended, while those in the city would be nourished better by the leftovers from the owner's meals, or that they would be clothed in better clothes to keep up appearances. The reasoning they both explained is that living in the close quarters of the city and the expectations of their neighbors, as well as the Code Noir dictation of how the enslaved should be treated, forced them to ensure that their enslaved people were well-fed and well-dressed, and presentable in ways that plantation slavery did not require. However, Dr. Miles explains that, quote, in Savannah and other southern port cities, urban slavery and rural slavery were inextricably linked, such that plantation owners had regular business in town and put their slaves to work in either location, unquote. Indeed, Samuel Herman, who built the Herman Grima House to showcase his wealth, immigrated to Louisiana from Germany, first to a plantation on the German coast in 1804, and then to the city in 1813, when he was 36 years old. This further explanation makes me question the motive of distinguishing urban enslavement from plantation slavery in modern New Orleans tours, even while I acknowledge that both tours emphasize the cruelty and violence of urban enslavement as well. Either one or two of the 7 people who were rescued from the fire died shortly after. Newspapers report both. What happened to the remaining 5 or 6 people is not documented. Any stories that explain what happened to them aren't based on documented evidence. What is documented dozens of times across the world was the story of Delphine Lalaurie and the fire at her mansion. I found articles from newspapers across the country and beyond recounting the scandalous story to their readers, many simply reprinting the stories from New Orleans papers like a wire service. This story was told and retold for months, making it a 19th century example of a viral news story. The story has never, in almost 200 years, been cured of the virus. After the fire, the property was purchased and rebuilt in 1837. In 1894, the numbering system was changed in the French Quarter, so the address was originally 282 Royal Street. The house we see today at the corner of what was formerly Hospital Street, but is now Governor Nichols Street, was also only 2 stories when it was built. The 3rd story was added later in the 19th century, according to the Historic New Orleans collection. So that bricked-up window that Delphine chased her young enslaved girl Leah out of? In 2024, the house was put on the market again for over $10 million. I studied the interior images of the home to try to determine what is behind the blocked window. See my blog with labeled photos linked in the description. More likely, it was an architectural choice or change on the inside of the house that left a blocked window, since there was no 3rd story in Delphine's time, and the house burned. Delphine really did escape to Paris and live the rest of her life in exile in France. She really was buried in Paris and then exhumed and reburied in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, according to Long's examination of the documentation. The grave with a plaque discovered in the 1940s was purchased by Paul and Blanc. Delphine's son was Jean Blanc, shortly before she was buried there. He had inherited a huge estate after his mother's death, along with his siblings, and was capable of pulling off any memorial he chose, no matter how exceptional. The plaque was misread to show her death as 1842 because of the corrosion, but she died in 1849, probably of illness. Sometimes tours will explain her death as a dramatic run-in with a boar on a hunting trip. While French death records never reveal the cause of death, She had been sick for some time, according to correspondence from her children who lived with her in Paris. Of her 6 children, Borgia, Pauline, Laura, Jean, Pauline, and Jean-Louis, Pauline, Laura, Pauline, and Jean-Louis all lived with her in Paris. Pauline, Laura, and Jean-Louis had been present the day of the fire. Pauline was a freshman for the 1833-1834 school year at Yale. He left after his freshman year. Neither Pauline nor Laura married. Pauline and Jean-Louis did not work while they were in Paris, so they all remained reliant on their mother. This was directly resultant from the fire and reveal of the torture, according to Long's interpretation. Delphine still has living descendants of both Borgia and Pauline in Louisiana and beyond. The home has had many owners over the years and served as many different types of businesses or establishments. Owners began capitalizing on the legends of the haunted house almost immediately, with Harriet Martineau's 1836 account in her Retrospect of Western Travel, when she interviewed eyewitnesses to the tragedy. She witnessed the building still in destruction during her New Orleans visit, as it wasn't rebuilt until 1837. In 1845, it first became a school, Franklin High School. In 1862, it became a music conservatory. In 1869, it became a business. In 1872, it became a school again, this time Lower Girls High School, which was a racially mixed school for girls that existed peacefully for a couple of years before white students forced those of African descent out, with no regulation from the superintendent or police. The Lower Girls High School moved in 1878 and closed in 1879. Then the mansion became the home of the New Orleans Conservatory of Music. The location became an apartment building and was home to fruit and vegetable vendors of Sicilian and Italian descent in the 1880s and 1890s, when the French Quarter was Piccolo Palermo. In 1893, Fortunato Greco, an Italian immigrant, procured the building and soon noticed the public's interest in seeing ghosts. He is seemingly the first owner to capitalize on the haunted house. He drew crowds who paid 10 cents each. The Haunted Exchange Saloon was opened between 1895 and 1909. Greco sold the building in 1916, and it continued as an apartment building where tenants would charge curious visitors to see the ghosts. Apparently, during this time, they would clank chains and dress in sheets to help the illusion along. In 1922, William Jennings Warrington opened a lunch house and then purchased the building in 1923. The mansion became the Warrington House in 1924, which was a shelter for men and boys experiencing homelessness. Warrington perpetuated and expanded the myths of the haunted house. Warrington sold to an organization of 32nd degree Masons of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, called the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, in 1932. But the Warrington House continued until 1942, and the Masons never used the building. It was next used as an apartment building again through the 1960s. From 1969 until 2000, it was again a private residence of a radiologist who restored the property. He sold to another out-of-town private owner who then sold to Nicolas Cage in 2006, who ended up losing it to foreclosure in 2009. It was sold in 2010 to another private investor who renovated the building, but allowed it to sit empty and unopened to visitors. In 2024, the building went on the market again for more than $10 million. Reportedly, an offer was accepted before the listing was public, but the real estate images provided a little insight into what that bricked-up window could be. People often try to explain Delphine's extreme cruelty by pointing to trauma she could blame on people of color. Some of these reasons include her parents were murdered by their enslaved people. She resented her father for having children with women of color and leaving portions of his estate to them, or she resented women of color because her husbands had affairs with them, among others. But evidence shows that none of this victim blaming is correct. It's much more likely that Delphine was just a very typical product of her time, fulfilling the expectations of a person of her status and not questioning the harm she caused. The truths about Southern antebellum race-based slavery are so horrific that we have painted a case that went viral in 1834 as an extreme. Unfortunately, she was not extreme. She was typical. She was just exposed. It makes you question all that we have accepted in the modern times without a critical analysis. that will be the horror stories of the future. Thank you for joining me on another dive into one of New Orleans' most famous ghost stories. Please like and subscribe for more stories from the deep, coming soon.